He didn't count cards. He didn't cheat. He used physics. For 3 years, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a college dropout named Doyne Farmer and a small band of physicists beat roulette in Las Vegas using a computer hidden in the sole of a shoe. They cracked a game that casinos had declared unbeatable for 200 years. And then, in a single catastrophic night in the Nevada desert, it all came apart. Not because the house caught them, because they caught themselves. To understand what Doyne Farmer built, you have to understand where he came from. Because this isn't a story that starts in Las Vegas. It starts in Silver City, New Mexico, in a small house where a boy named Doyne Farmer grew up staring at the sky, taking apart radios and asking questions that made his teachers uncomfortable. Doyne Farmer was born in 1952. His father was a forest ranger. His mother was a school teacher. There was no money, no connections, no silver spoon, just a kid with a ferocious mind and nowhere near enough to feed it. Silver City was a mining town, the kind of the place where you either left or you disappeared. Doyne left. He won a scholarship to the University of California, Santa Cruz in the early 1970s. Santa Cruz in those days wasn't just a university, it was a universe. The 60s hadn't died there yet. Professors wore sandals to class. Students built communes in the hills. Physics professors talked about consciousness. The whole campus ran on the energy of people who believed that the world could be understood, dismantled, and rebuilt from scratch. Doyne fit perfectly. He was tall, shaggy-haired, intense in the way that quiet people get intense. The kind of intensity that doesn't announce itself until it's already 3 steps ahead of you. He studied physics, not because it was practical, because it was the closest thing he'd found to a language that described how everything actually worked. And it was at Santa Cruz that he found his people, a loose collective of graduate students and physics obsessives who would eventually call themselves the Eudaimonic Pi. They lived communally. They shared everything. They argued about quantum mechanics over cheap wine and believed, with the sincerity that only young, brilliant people can sustain, that science could be turned into a weapon against the house. The ringleader of the group, alongside Farmer, was Norman Packard. Packard was everything Farmer was, and more. Methodical where Doyne was intuitive, patient where Doyne was restless. The two of them together were a machine, and what they decided to build was a machine. The whole thing started, as so many great stories do, with a dare. A friend took Doyne to a casino in Reno in 1975. Doyne watched the roulette wheel spin for 20 minutes and said something that changed his life. He said he thought he could predict where the ball would land. Not always, not perfectly, just often enough to matter. Just enough to flip the odds. His friend laughed. The casino laughed. The mathematics of roulette, everyone agreed, were iron. The house edge was built into the wheel itself. There were 2 green slots, 0 and 00. That setup guaranteed the house took 5.26 cents on every dollar bet, over time. You couldn't beat that. It was arithmetic. It was law. Doyne Farmer heard all of that and decided to build a computer anyway. Here's what most people don't understand about roulette, and here's what the casinos have spent decades hoping you never figure out. Roulette is not a game of pure chance. It is a game of physics, and physics, unlike luck, has rules. When a dealer spins a roulette wheel, 2 things are set in motion. The wheel itself rotates in one direction. The ball is launched in the opposite direction along the track that runs around the inside rim. The ball travels, decelerates due to friction, drops off the track, bounces across the numbered diamonds on the wheel's surface, and comes to rest in a numbered pocket Every one of those events is governed by Newtonian mechanics, the same equations Isaac Newton wrote in the 1600s, the same physics that describes how planets orbit the sun, how cannonballs arc through the air, how a pendulum swings, deterministic, predictable. In theory, if you know the initial conditions precisely enough, you can calculate exactly where the ball will land. That's the theory. The practice is harder, much harder. The variables are brutal. The speed of the wheel, the speed of the ball, the point on the wheel where the ball enters the track, the tilt of the wheel, because no wheel is perfectly level, the scatter pattern of the ball when it hits the diamonds, because those bounces are chaotic in the mathematical sense, sensitive to tiny differences in initial conditions. Change any one of those variables by a fraction and your prediction shifts. But here's what Doyne understood that nobody else had fully grasped. You didn't need to predict exactly where the ball would land. You didn't need perfection. You just needed to predict better than random chance. You just needed a 2% edge, because with a 2% edge on a game where the house starts with 5.26%, you flip the equation entirely. Suddenly, you're not the gambler. You are the house. The key insight, and this is the one that the casinos still do not like to talk about, is timing. The ball and the wheel are both in motion at the moment a bet is placed. Bets can be placed after the wheel is spun in most casinos, right up until the dealer waves their hand and calls no more bets. That window, usually 8 to 12 seconds after the spin, is enough time to observe the initial conditions and make a calculation. Not a calculation in your head. No human brain can do that fast enough, but a computer can. Doyne and Norman did not invent this idea from thin air. They knew about the work of Edward Thorpe, the mathematician who had cracked blackjack card counting in the early 1960s and written about theoretical roulette prediction. They knew about Claude Shannon, the father of information theory, who had built an early roulette prediction device with Thorpe in the early 1960s, just to prove it could be done. Shannon and Thorpe had proved the concept. They had never taken it to a casino seriously, and they had never tried to build a system around it. Doyne and Norman decided to finish what Shannon and Thorpe had started. Except, they were going to build something small enough to hide in a shoe. And they were going to take it to Las Vegas. Building a wearable computer in 1976 was not like building one today. There was no Apple Store. There were no microprocessors you could order online. There was a surplus electronics shop in Santa Cruz, a soldering iron, and 2 graduate students working out of a house they shared with 8 other people. The device went through years of iteration, years of failure, burned fingertips, ruined components, and arguments that shook the walls of the commune. What they eventually built was genuinely extraordinary for its time. A toe-operated computer, housed in a custom-molded sole, fitted inside a shoe, connected by thin wires running up the leg to a radio transmitter. Here is how it worked. A player at the roulette table would tap a micro switch hidden in the toe of their shoe, 1 tap for each time a fixed point on the wheel passed a reference point to establish the wheel's speed. Then another sequence of taps for the ball to establish the ball's speed and position. The computer, running on a purpose-built program that Doyne and Norman had coded and tested hundreds of times, would calculate the most likely sector of the wheel where the ball would land. Then it would transmit a series of small vibrations delivered through a solenoid buzzer taped to the skin beneath the player's shirt, on the stomach or the side. Different vibration patterns corresponded to different sectors of the wheel. The player, without looking at anything unusual, without making any gesture that a pit boss would notice, would feel a buzz and place their bet on the corresponding numbers. The coding, the housing, the transmission, all of it was handmade. Doyne's partner in life, and in the project Letty, helped sew the wiring into clothing. Norman's girlfriend soldered components at the kitchen table. The whole group, 8 or 10 people at various times, pulled the project along communally. This was not a corporation. It was not a hedge fund. It was a commune that decided to go to war with Vegas. They tested in Santa Cruz first. Doyne bought a casino-quality roulette wheel and set it up in the living room. They ran thousands of spins. They logged data. They refined the algorithm. They burned out components and rebuilt them. They got electric shocks from improperly insulated wires, sometimes severe enough to blister the skin, and kept going anyway. The first real casino test came in 1977 in Reno. Doyne walked into a small casino, a shoe with a computer in the sole, wires taped to his calf, a buzzer pressed against his ribs. He stood at a roulette table and tapped his toe. The system worked. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but the numbers, over a long enough session, tilted in his direction. The edge was real, it was small, and it was real, and it was enough. They went back to Santa Cruz and kept building. By 1978, Doyne and the eudaimonic pie were ready for Las Vegas. Not Reno, not Tahoe. Las Vegas, the real thing, the Strip. The casinos had seen every angle, every system, every con artist with a plan and a prayer. They drove from Santa Cruz in a van they called the Whole Earth Truck, 3 or 4 of them at a time, rotating in and out. Doyne and Norman, Letty, and other members of the collective. They stayed in cheap motels off the Strip. They ate at diners. They dressed like tourists because they were, in a sense, tourists with a plan. The methodology was precise. Doyne or Norman, usually Doyne because he had the nerve for it, would sit or stand at a roulette table and spend the first 30 minutes simply watching, mapping the wheel. Every roulette wheel has a bias, a slight tilt, a sticky pocket, a diamond that catches the ball more than others. Doyne was cataloging those biases in real time, building a mental model of this specific wheel before the computer ever came into play. Then the tapping would begin, subtle, natural, the kind of thing you did when you were nervous or bored. The rhythmic press of a toe against the floor. Each press was a data point fed into the system in the sole of his shoe. The buzzes would come back, stomach, side, a pattern of vibrations that resolved into a number sector. And Doyne would reach forward and place his bet. Not confidently, not dramatically, the way a tourist places a bet, tentatively, with a small sigh. The early Las Vegas sessions were electric. The system worked better on the Strip than it had in Reno. The wheels were higher quality and more consistent, which paradoxically made them easier to model. The edge climbed above 2%, sometimes higher. But there were problems. The hardware was brutally unreliable. The buzzer would cut out at the worst possible moment. The toe switch would stick, logging phantom taps. Once, a wire pulled loose from the transmitter mid-session, and Doyne received a sharp electric shock that made him flinch hard enough that a pit boss came over to ask if he was all right. He said he was fine. He cashed out and walked to the bathroom, where he spent 10 minutes pulling the system off his body and stuffing it into his jacket. They went back to Santa Cruz and rebuilt again. By 1979 and into 1980, the system had been refined to the point where it was genuinely producing consistent results, not life-changing money in any single session. Roulette is slow, and the bet sizes they used were deliberately modest to avoid attention. But over dozens of sessions across multiple casinos, the wins were accumulating. They had a bookkeeping system, Every bet, every outcome, every session logged in notebooks that Norman kept in a lockbox in the van. The numbers were real. Over hundreds of hours of play, the edge held. The physics worked. They were beating roulette. Back in Santa Cruz, the commune dynamic shifted. Word spread through their circle. New people wanted in. People who had no part in the years of building and burning and electric shocks now saw the outcome and wanted a piece of it. Doyne and Norman had always run the project as a collective, profits shared among contributors. But the definition of contributor was getting murky. There was money coming in now, not a flood, not the kind of scores you read about in Vegas heist movies, but real money. And real money does something to people, even brilliant people, even people who live in communes and believe in the philosophical purity of their enterprise. It makes them calculate differently. Doyne started feeling it, the paranoia that comes with success in an environment where success is supposed to be impossible. Every pit boss who glanced in his direction became a threat. Every security camera a potential eye on his shoe. He started developing rituals, specific casinos, specific tables, specific times of day. He would walk through a casino floor before sitting down, watching the flow of the room the way a poker player reads a table. Norman was quieter about it, but felt the same pressure. They were doing something that, while not clearly illegal in Nevada at that specific time, existed in a legal gray area that neither of them had fully mapped. They were not cheating in the traditional sense. The device did not interfere with the wheel or the ball. It simply made calculations. But Nevada gaming law was a living thing, and the casinos had lawyers and lobbyists and the full attention of state regulators. They knew the window would not stay open forever. Las Vegas in the late 1970s was not the surveillance state it has become today. There were cameras, yes, but fewer of them, lower resolution, watched by fewer eyes. The eye in the sky was real, but it was not omniscient. And the casino security culture of that era was still built primarily around catching card counters and dice mechanics. The idea that someone might be beating roulette with a computer in their shoe existed in approximately zero security manuals. But the casinos had something more powerful than technology. They had pattern recognition built into the bones of every pit boss who had worked a floor for 20 years. The first real heat came not from surveillance footage, but from a pit boss at a mid-strip casino whose name Doyne never learned. Doyne had been playing for about 90 minutes. The system was running well. He was up, not dramatically, but visibly enough that the pit boss had been watching for the last 20 minutes. The man walked over and stood behind Doyne for 30 seconds without saying anything. Then, he leaned forward and said quietly, and without hostility, that Doyne seemed to have a good feel for the wheel tonight. Doyne said he was just lucky. The pit boss smiled the way people smile when they know the answer before the question. Then he said the table was closing for maintenance. Right now. Doyne took his chips to the cage, cashed out, and walked out into the Nevada night. Nothing was said about a device. Nothing was said about cheating. But the message was clean and final. They knew something. They did not know what, but they knew something. After that night, the team changed their approach. Different casinos, different team members playing so that the same face did not appear twice at the same property. They had 4 or 5 people trained on the system by this point, which meant the operation had grown complex enough to require actual coordination, scheduling, communication, a level of organization that a Santa Cruz commune was not naturally built for. And underneath all of that structure, a fault line was forming. The fault line had a name, or rather, it had several names, because the fracture that destroyed the eudaimonic pie was not a single betrayal. It was a slow accumulation of small ones, each reasonable on its own, devastating in aggregate. The money was the first problem, not the amount. The distribution. Doyne and Norman had set up a profit-sharing arrangement from the beginning, but the arrangement had been designed for a team of 8 people, all equally committed, all equally present, all equally invested in the outcome. By 1980, that team had changed. Some original members had drifted away. New people had come in, people who had contributed less to the building and more to the playing. And everyone had a different memory of what the original agreement said. A member of the collective, someone who had been part of the project for less than a year, claimed a larger share than Doyne believed he had earned. The argument started small, the way these things always do. A conversation that went slightly wrong. A tone that did not sit right. Then, a second conversation, harder than the first. Then a meeting where everyone sat in the living room and nobody looked directly at anyone else. Norman tried to mediate. Norman was always the mediator, but Norman had his own frustrations, quieter ones. He had done an equal share of the intellectual work, maybe more of the mathematical modeling, and had spent less time in the casinos because Doyne had more nerve for the floor work. He watched Doyne get the credit. Not consciously, not bitterly, but he watched it. The emotional weight of the enterprise was also taking its toll in ways that a commune's collective idealism had not prepared them for. This was not a game anymore. It had not been a game for years. It was a covert operation conducted in hostile territory by people who were also trying to finish graduate degrees, maintain relationships, and figure out what they wanted to do with the rest of their lives. Doyne and Letty's relationship, which had been the emotional anchor of the whole project, was under enormous strain. The months on the road, the secrecy, the electric shocks, the wins that did not quite add up to what they had imagined. All of it had ground something down between them. And then came the conversation that Doyne would replay for years afterward. A core member of the team, someone he trusted completely, told him privately that 2 other members had been skimming, holding back chips from logged sessions. Small amounts, not enough to notice in any single session, enough to matter over dozens of them. Doyne did not want to believe it. He went back through the notebooks. Norman helped him reconstruct the sessions. The numbers did not lie. The shortfall was real. He confronted them. The conversation was ugly. There were denials, then partial admissions, then the kind of defensive anger that people display when they have been caught doing something they knew was wrong. The trust that had held the eudaimonic pie together through years of failure and rebuilding and shared electric shocks and commune dinners and the absolute belief that they were doing something extraordinary. That trust cracked clean through. The team fractured. Not all at once, but the fracture was irreversible. The night it ended began like most nights on the Strip, warm, loud, the air carrying that specific Las Vegas smell of cigarette smoke and air conditioning and the faint sugary residue of casino carpets. It was 1981. Doyne had decided to do one final run. A clean score to split the remaining partnership and give everyone what they were owed so the whole enterprise could be dissolved with some dignity. Norman was there. 2 other team members. They had chosen a casino they had not visited in several months, a mid-strip property where no one would recognize them. The system was in the shoe, the wires were taped, the buzzer was in place. Everything that had worked before was in place. Doyne found a wheel. He spent his 30 minutes watching. The wheel had a bias he could read easily, a slightly sticky pocket in the low teens. He began tapping. The first hour was good. The edge was there. The buzzes were clean. The bets were landing in the right sectors. He was up close to $4,000, the best single session run he had had in months. Norman, playing at an adjacent table and watching through peripheral vision, gave a small nod. They were hitting. Then, the buzzer changed. Not dramatically. Not with a sudden failure. It started sending irregular signals, a pattern that did not correspond to any sector in the algorithm. Doyne tapped his toe to reset the input sequence. The buzzer fired twice in quick succession, which in their code meant the second most likely sector. He bet accordingly. The ball landed 2 sectors away. He reset again. The buzzer fired 3 times, a pattern that should not have been possible given what he had fed into the system. Something was wrong with the transmission. He did not know if it was the solenoid, or the radio link, or the computer itself, but something in the chain between his shoe and his ribs had broken down. And here is where the story turned. Because the old Doyne, the Doyne from 1977 in Reno with the first prototype and everything to learn, would have walked away, cashed out, gone back to the motel and opened the device and found the fault. This Doyne kept playing, not on the computer signals anymore. Those were gone. He was playing on feel, on intuition, on the accumulated knowledge of a man who had spent 4 years studying this specific game. He told himself it was not gambling. He told himself he knew the wheel. He told himself that the bias he had observed in the first hour was still real even without the computer confirming it. He lost the $4,000 back in 40 minutes. He raised his bet, the kind of move that every gambler who has ever raised a bet has told himself was not a mistake. He was chasing. He knew he was chasing. He kept betting. In the space of 90 minutes, with a system that was not working and a logic that had replaced science with desperation, Doyne Farmer lost $11,000. Nearly everything the team had accumulated over the previous 2 months of sessions. He cashed out what was left, walked outside, sat on the curb of a Las Vegas parking lot at 2 in the morning, and stared at the desert sky. Norman came out 5 minutes later and sat down beside him without saying anything. They stayed like that for a long time. The strip glittered behind them. Somewhere inside, the wheel was still spinning. The eudaimonic pie dissolved not with a confrontation or a legal proceeding, but with the quiet administrative sadness of a project that had simply run out of momentum. Debts were settled as best they could be. The notebooks were packed away. The shoe that held the computer in its soul was disassembled. Some components were kept for sentimental reasons. Most were thrown away. Nevada changed its laws in 1985 to explicitly ban the use of devices to predict outcomes in casino games. The law was aimed squarely at what Doyne and Norman had done, and others who had attempted similar projects. But by the time the law passed, the eudaimonic pie had already been gone for years. The state was closing a door that nobody was standing behind anymore. Doyne Farmer went on to become one of the most respected physicists and complex systems theorists of his generation. He earned his doctorate. He joined the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He co-founded the prediction company in the early 1990s with Norman Packard, using the same principles they had developed for Roulette to build predictive financial models. They applied chaos theory and physics to stock market behavior, the same intuition, the same methodology, aimed at a much larger wheel. The prediction company was acquired by UBS in 2006 for a sum that nobody involved in the eudaimonic pie's roulette sessions would have believed possible when they were sleeping 4 to a van outside a casino in 1978. Norman Packard built an equally distinguished career. His work in complex systems and artificial life established him as a foundational figure in fields that barely existed when he was soldering components at a kitchen table in Santa Cruz. Letty and Doyne did not survive the project as a couple, though they remained connected through the web of friendships the commune had built. The project had asked too much of too many things, love included. The story of the eudaimonic pie became public in 1985 when journalist Thomas Bass published a book called The Eudaimonic Pie, later released in the United States as The Newtonian Casino. It became a cult classic. Physicists read it. Casino managers read it. A generation of mathematically inclined gamblers read it and went to roulette tables with notebooks and dreamed. Casinos responded by installing barriers on their wheels to reduce scatter predictability, by tightening the no more bets calls, and by training dealers to spin with more variation. They did not beat the physics. They made the physics harder to measure in the time window available, which is, in the end, all you can do. You cannot change the laws of the universe. You can only make them harder to apply. Here is the question that the story of Doyne Farmer and the eudaimonic pie leaves hanging in the desert air. The same question that hangs over every Las Vegas story, over Benny Binion and Steve Wynn and the Stardust and the Riviera. The same question the desert itself seems to ask. Was it worth it? They cracked roulette. Genuinely cracked it. Not as a thought experiment, not as a paper in a physics journal, but in the actual casinos, under the actual lights, with pit bosses watching and electric shocks buzzing up their legs. They took a game the entire gambling industry had declared unbeatable for 2 centuries and made it beatable. That is not nothing. That is extraordinary. But they also lost. Not just the $11,000 on that final night. They lost the trust that had built the collective. They lost the relationships that had made the project worth doing. They lost the purity of the enterprise, that beautiful, crazy idea that a commune of physicists in Santa Cruz could pit the laws of physics against the house and win. The house did not break them. They broke themselves. Greed in small doses. Exhaustion in large ones. The ordinary human failure that no algorithm can protect against. Doyne Farmer spent years studying complex systems, trying to understand how order emerges from chaos, how patterns form in systems that appear random. It is tempting to think that somewhere in that work is a response to that night in the parking lot, a way of understanding what the roulette wheel was really teaching him. The wheel spins. The ball drops. The physics are real, but the people betting are not machines. And no computer in a shoe has ever fixed that. That was the story of the man who cracked Vegas roulette and still lost. Which part hit you hardest? Tell me in the comments, and if you love discovering the real people behind the neon, hit subscribe because every legend had a story, and Vegas never forgets.